Hello, everybody. How's everybody doing today? All right. So we are about to rock and roll here. We are live on all of the different places at the moment. So, want to welcome everyone out there that is checking this out with us online today. This is our fifth go around of these so far, and they've been a lot of fun and very educational, and we're getting a lot of awesome feedback on them as well too. So today we have Mr. Derrick Shannon joining us. Derrick is currently the percussion caption head and battery arranger for the Blue Knights, and this would have been his first season there, so this is kind of a bummer. But we will be back in the drum corps scene eventually. And then he's also worked with the Madison Scouts, the Phantom Regiment. He marched with the Phantom Regiment and the Cavaliers. He's done a ton of things. Is a very well-respected teacher and educator on the scene. So we want to welcome him and hand it over to him to take it away.
All right, how's everybody doing tonight? Everybody ready to get some drumming in? All right, so I've seen a little bit of what Brett and some of the other people have done. So I'm going to do some similar things, but also try and introduce some new things so you're not getting the same thing every single week. So, like Mr. Wiggins said, my name is Derrick Shannon. I'm the battery ranger of the Blue Knights currently, formerly of the Madison Scouts and the Phantom Regiment. Spent a lot of time at Phantom Regiment. I actually marched there and then was captain ahead there for a number of years. So basically, throughout the course of my life, I've been able to take so many different things from so many different great instructors, including people like Brett Kuhn and Paul Rennick and people along those lines, and morph them into my own. And that's basically what's kind of made me what I am today. So we're gonna basically gonna go through some of my exercises, go through some of my philosophies just in general on drumming and teaching, and then let me know if you guys have any questions along the way. All right, thumbs up if everybody can see that music. Cool. All right, so this is just my basic packet. All right, there's nothing really crazy. There's nothing really hard or difficult within this packet, but I do think that it has a ton of the basics. Okay, I'm definitely a huge proponent on making sure that we have a great foundation, right? And that's what allows us to kind of get to some of those harder show music licks that we kind of have in our shows nowadays. So we're going to start with this, and then we're going to move to actually a show lick that I've written, and we're going to talk about how I break those things down and how they relate to what we're doing here. All right. So we're going to start off with 8 on the hand. Okay. I like to start 8 on the hand a little bit different than some other people. What I like to do is this variation right here that I call 3, 6, 9, 12, right? Which is basically starting at a low dynamic and then bringing it up to our large dynamic. Okay. Reason being is when you start to warm up for a workout, for example, you don't necessarily go for the heaviest lift right away, right? You're probably going to do some type of warm up, maybe some type of cardio or something along those lines to kind of get you going. So this is what that exercise does for me. Okay. So before we get into that, let's go ahead and go to our normal 8 on the hand. Right. Very simple. Just these first 2 lines here. Right. We're going to play those together, and we're going to play us all at piano. Okay. Here we go with me. Okay, now we're going to do that same exact thing. We're going to do it at like a mezzo piano or a 6-inch height, depending upon however you think. So a little bit more of a volume. Okay, I like to think if that last volume we just played was 25%, now we're going to go to 50%. Okay, and play that same thing at that height. All right, and then let's do the same thing. Now we're going to be at 75%, mezzo forte, 9 inches, however you want to think about it. All right, and last but not least, we're going to do this at 100% volume or forte, 12 inches, however you want to think about that. Okay. Now we're going to go back to that variation where we were talking about where we basically incorporated all of those different dynamics. Okay. I'm a huge proponent of talking about music as if it were music and not necessarily in heights and things along those lines. So sometimes you'll hear me say things like 3, 6, 9, 12, where particularly I don't say those as much as my staff might or something along those lines. When you're with my staff, you would basically be getting all the information. They're going to say it's exactly this, exactly that, and they'll define it in certain ways. When you're with me, a lot of times you would just get, hey, I need this to be louder, I need this to be softer, or hey, we need to make sure that this gets over the bar line. So I don't typically use a height structure necessarily, but more so a dynamic structure and talking about just ranges of dynamics. Okay. So we're going to do the same variation. I like to think about maybe that 25, 50, 75, 100% method. okay, when I think about like these different dynamics, okay? So basically, if 100% is our full stroke, a quarter of that will be our 25% or our first starting dynamic. Okay, so we're going to do this exercise 3, 6, 9, 12. Here we go. Again. All right, so I really like to use that exercise as like the first exercise that I play, as opposed to having everything be all at a high dynamic. And the main reason behind that is like what I was talking about before, which is making sure that we're allowing our limbs and allowing our muscles to get warm. Okay, if we start at that high dynamic, a lot of times we're trying to go for our most stressful thing we could play. We're trying to play as many loud notes as possible in a row as we can, right? Which, if you think about, drumming in comparison to anything else in the sports world or anything along those lines, a lot of times they do mini warm-ups that kind of get them to playing full out, okay? So that's one of the things I like to start with just in general, okay? I'm a huge proponent about making sure that we're playing as relaxed as possible, all right? Some of the things I would talk about just in general is I like to think about holding my sticks as if I'm holding an egg, right? If I squeeze an egg too tight, I'm probably going to break that egg, right? If I don't squeeze the egg tight enough, it's going to fall out of my hand, and I'm still going to break that egg on the floor. Okay. So either way, what I like to tell, especially my younger students, is that either way, there's going to be like egg goop over your shoes, right? So we want to make sure we hold the stick with just enough pressure that we can hold, we would not break an egg, but not too much pressure. Sorry, not too much pressure that we'd break it, but just enough that it wouldn't fall out of our hand. Okay. So I have a very relaxed grip and typically have even pressure throughout my whole hand, just in general. Okay. So that's a basis that I like to use for all percussion instruments, not just the marching percussion realm. But I think that's something that is really great because that allows our sticks and everything else to vibrate to their fullest potential. Okay. Another analogy for that is if I were to grasp my sticks and hold them as tight as I could and click them together, I kind of get a choked off sound. If I were to loosen that up and use that egg analogy, you can tell a huge difference in the quality the stick is vibrating in. Okay. So in general, I always want my sticks to vibrate with that same tone as if I'm holding an egg. Okay. So as we start to play this exercise and as we start to get into two heights, right? Two heights is where I see most people squeeze the stick the most. Okay. So that's one thing that I want you to think about just in general as we move into the two-heighted realm. Okay. All right. So we are going to play some more eights here, and I'm going to throw on some music for you guys as we do that. So if you give me 1 second here. All right, so we're going to go back to our original eights exercise, and we're going to do some variations on that. Okay. A lot of the times people ask me, how do I build more chops? And this is one of the ways that I kind of build some more chops in general, which I think is great because this is obviously a chop session, right? Chopping with the stars. So one of the ways is just by playing 8 on a hand, right? So I'm going to show you guys some variations that I do. They're pretty simple, right? But as far as how I track myself and how I track my students and things along those lines, I think is really important to kind of think about. Okay. So we're going to start with this exercise. We're going to start at a pretty high volume, right? Let's say we're full out 100%, and we're going to play 8 on a hand. Thumbs up if you guys can hear this music. Cool. All right. So I've got Logic pulled up right now, so I'm sure I'm going to get some questions as far as like where I'm getting these things from. And these are just Logic loops. So they're pretty simple. Logic, I believe, costs $200 if you have a Mac. But there are also loops in GarageBand, which I believe is less expensive and things along those lines. And there are tons and tons and tons of royalty-free loops that you guys can find online. And I can send some links for those if you guys want later. So we're going to go ahead and play that 8 on a hand exercise, right? And we're going to start to do some variations on that. All right, let's start full out the same way we just did. Here we go. I'll tap you off every single time. going to do 16 on the hand, the same way. We're going to do 32 on the hand. That's what that means, all right hand, all right. All left. All right, so that's kind of the sequence. We go from 8 on the hand to 16 on the hand to 32 on the hand to what would be 64 on the hand, or all right hand, and then the next rep, all left hand, okay? Right now, my tempo is 144, okay? And basically, over the course of time, I would bump this, let's say 12 clicks over the course of time. So my next tempo will probably be 156, 168, etc., right? Until we find our breaking point. When you find your breaking point, that's kind of where I want you to stop and kind of hang out at that point, okay? So let's go ahead and do that same thing. We're going to do this at 180 this time. So we bumped it 12 clicks, 12 clicks, 12 clicks until we got to 180 now. We're going to do the same thing. This time, no tap off in between. 8 on the hand, straight into 16 on the hand, straight into 32, straight into all right, straight into all left. All right, does that make sense to everybody? Thumbs up if you understand. Cool. Here we go. This is 180, same thing. And 32. All right. Okay, so as we get to those faster tempos, obviously the biggest thing to think about is to stay as relaxed as possible, which is usually easier said than done, right? Thinking about that egg analogy helps a lot, right? Thinking about making sure that our tendon right here where our wrist is staying nice and relaxed is probably the most important, right? Because in this mode, we're not necessarily trying to think about using a ton of finger. We're still trying to make sure that we use our primary motivator, which is our wrist. As we get faster and faster, we will definitely incorporate more and more finger, right? When it comes to things along those lines, people always ask me, do you have a certain breaking point? Is it this tempo with this rhythm? And I usually say, no, I don't have a certain breaking point, right? It's different for everybody, right? But one thing to kind of think about as you're building chops is you want to make sure that we're working on these muscles right here, which come from turning our primary motivator, which is our wrist, okay? So let's do that one more time. We're going to do this at 200 beats per minute this time. Listen to our groove that we just had for a second. So this is starting to sound just a little frantic for me. So I'm going to kind of give us kind of more of a halftime feel. You kind of notice that as I was playing that exercise, I was kind of almost like bobbing my head to the halftime feel, right? Anything you can do to try and keep yourself more relaxed is what we're looking for here as we're trying to build more chops, okay? So we're going to do that same exact exercise, 8, 16, 32, 64 on the right, 64 on the left, okay? No tap off in between. trying to think about staying as relaxed as possible the whole time. Here we go. All right, so a lot of times, especially as we get into exercises like this, I like to talk about everything that's not the playing hand. And the reason being is I want to make sure that we're exerting only the energy needed to the exercise, which is to the playing hand, right? And a lot of times there's unnecessary tension elsewhere in the body, right? A lot of times if you watch your tacit hand, for example, if you see your tacit hand kind of moving around like this as we start to play, especially some of the faster dynamics, right? Then there's probably some tension that's coming all the way up through your arm, through your upper body, all the way to your tacit hand, right? So it's very, very imperative that tacit hand is perfectly still, right? Because that is basically saying that it's at peace and that it's not exerting any energy that we could be putting towards the exercise itself, okay? So as I play this, I want to make sure that everything on the other side of my body is perfectly still. And that's so, so, so important, okay? So as we continue on, we would, let's say that 200 was our breaking point. Basically, the goal is that the next day we would do it 202. The day after that, we do it 204. The day after that, we do it 206. The day after that, 208, 210, etc., until you reach your next breaking point. Okay. Any point that you feel like you're not as relaxed as you should be, or you're not getting a great quality of sound, I would take it back down a few clicks for a few days, right, and see if we can continue to kind of build that progression. Does anybody have any questions on any of that so far?
I don't think there have been so far. I think that all made pretty good. That all made sense, and the logic loops are cool.
Cool. All right, so we're going to move to an accent tap exercise now. Okay. So I have two different accent tap variation exercises that I like to use. One has multiple accents in a row, okay, very similar to 8 on the hand. The other one has like one accent and multiple inner beats in a row, okay. I'm going to kind of explain my process, my thought process behind them kind of as we go here. So this exercise is 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, all right. So we just have 5 accents, 5 inner beats, 4 accents, 4 inner beats, 3 accents, 3 inner beats, 2 accents, 2 inner beats, 1 accent, 1 inner beat, okay. So it's pretty simple from that standpoint. I'm going to try and get the whole page on here. Is that too small for you guys? Thumbs up if it's good, thumbs down if it's too small. Cool.
Hey, Derrick.
Yep.
Just real quick, you may want to mute your mic audio when you go to play because it's phasing with the computer audio.
Okay, let me see here. So then you probably wouldn't hear me then, right?
Right. Yeah. Unless you can run like the sound through the speakers or something, and it got really, really overly funky there for a while.
Everybody's like, "Oh, what's going on here?"
Yeah.
Let me see here.
Yeah, the other option may be just play it through like your computer speakers so that we at least hear that and you in the real time. The audio is running a little bit ahead of you playing.
So let me see if this is any better. Is that any better?
That was a little bit better.
A little better.
Yeah, it's still just off ever so slightly. So.
Okay. All right.
But the world can live with it also.
All right. So let's go on to our accent tap exercise 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. I'll play it with you guys a few times, and we'll kick the music on and play it without me audibly. Okay. So again, this is 5 accents, 5 interbeats, 4 accents, 4 interbeats, etc. throughout this whole exercise. So it's pretty simple. So let's just go ahead and try and read it down. All right. Here we go. Okay, so this exercise is a pretty simple one, but the one thing to kind of think about the most is we're trying to focus on two-heighted playing now, okay? The only time that we go from one height to two heights or from our high height to our low height or vice versa is one time in every single measure, okay? So some of the tendencies that I see that people have would be to over-accent the very last accent before it gets to that interbeat, kind of like this. Okay, so we want to make sure that there are 5 notes that are exactly the same before we even think about changing anything from a height standpoint or from a pressure standpoint, right? Okay. From there, I like to not think about squeezing the stick necessarily to get that inner note, the smaller notes or the lower notes, but I like to think just of changing my degree of wrist turn, right? My degree of wrist turn is very high here, right? And then I'm choosing to just change my wrist turn to a smaller degree of wrist turn at the very end there, okay? So again, I don't necessarily want to squeeze the stick because that's going to change our tone, that's going to change our quality of sound just in general, but I want to make sure I'm trying to keep that same egg analogy pressure in my hand throughout the whole exercise. Okay, so let's do that same thing again, okay? We're going to go ahead and play this with the track, and I'm going to mute myself while I'm playing this time so that you guys cannot hear me, but hopefully you guys can still see me. Here we go. So Terry, is that a better or worse scenario than we had before?
Yeah. Do you have? Is there a speaker coming out of your computer that you can just play it through?
Yes. So.
So just like I would say, like turn the sound off of the screen share, and then just play it back through your system.
Let's try this. Is that better?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best option. We can't hear the track quite as clearly, but it all lines up better.
Okay. All right, so we will continue on like that. All right, so as we continue on with this exercise, we get into the next variation, which is the one note variation. Right? We have one accent, and then we have all of our inner beats. Now, if we were to start with this exercise, and typically a lot of accent tap exercises do start like this, where we have one accent and then multiple inner beats in a row, right? Your tendency is going to be to over squeeze that accent note because it's only one accent, right? So it'd be very easy for me, example, to play the 4 pattern like this. And just pounding those accents, right? Now, because we played the other exercise, hopefully we'll learn how to have a nice light touch just in general throughout all of those heights, right? And we're trying to apply that same exact thing to this next exercise. Right? Where it's purely a degree of wrist turn that's changing as opposed to think about squeezing the stick to stop the stick for those lower notes, right? So let's go ahead and play this exercise, right? Again, it's pretty simple. It's just 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right? And you do 4 on each hand before you switch, okay? Here we go. All right, and I also like to do a variation on this exercise where I basically combine the two, right? So I take the first measure from this first exercise, right, which is 5 up, 5 down, and then the second measure from the next exercise, which is 5-note pattern with one accent on the first note of that pattern, okay? So for example, it would be something like this. Etc. Okay, and my main reason for that is it's a constant reminder of what the hand pressure should be like, what the stroke style should be like, and things along those lines as we start to get into those single accents. Okay, so that's a little bit about how I approach multiple heights, just in general. So far, some of the things just to recap is just want to make sure that we are as relaxed as possible, right? We want to make sure that everything flows, right? We want to make sure we're not exerting energy towards things that we don't necessarily need because we want to make sure that mentally we're exerting energy only towards those things that are difficult, right? Or the things that need the energy at the time, which is primarily the hand that's playing, right? As opposed to the hand that's not playing. Or as we get into some of the more complicated aspects of some of the musical things we have, a lot of times the playing has to be second nature because we have choreography on top of it, or we have the other visual responsibilities as well, right? So those a lot of times take a lot more physical energy than the drumming itself. So we want to make sure that we're allowing ourselves to have energy towards that visual aspect that we don't necessarily need to put forth in the drumming and make it so physical up top, if that makes sense. All right, we're going to move over to some double beat here. So we are purely going to look at these first 2 staves here. It's pretty stock double beat, right? We're going to kind of talk about how I get from our typical double beat exercise to starting to play rolls here in a little bit, okay? Here we go. Same thing. so that's a pretty stock double beat exercise, right? I like to take that and kind of put some duple format things in the middle of it, right? Because one of the things that I feel like is a disconnect in a lot of younger students, especially, they do a great job of playing that exercise that we just played, but by the time we get to playing rolls, a lot of times it looks or sounds like this. And I say, play double beat again. And they have this huge, big, full quality. And I say, play rolls again. And I'm like, well, play rolls like you play double beat. And they go, exactly the same, right? So our goal is we want big, beefy rolls just like we have in our double beat exercise. So therefore, we want our rolls to sound like, right? So I'm going to talk about a little bit about how I tend to bridge that gap, just in general, okay? So I have another exercise here for you. I'm going to switch screens here. Thumbs up if you can see that new screen. Cool. All right, so this is that same exercise, but with some duple format things in between, okay? So for example, this first 4 measures is going to sound like this. Okay, so my goal is I want my double stroke to sound exactly the same as I go from the triplet format to the duple format. Okay, so let's go ahead and play this exercise. We're only going to play 8 measures of this exercise. Okay, so we're going to go from here and stopping here. So that will be the chunk that we play. And let's see. Thumbs up if you can hear this all right. Okay, so we're going to do that exercise there. Let's say we go back to our 144 tempo. All right, here we go. We'll get 8 clicks and you guys will be in here. All right, let's do that same thing again. Okay, so that is what I like to start with for my beginners and my younger kids. Okay, for my older kids, what I like to do is I like to change this sticking right here to an inverted sticking. So we would have this pattern. Does everybody see that? So basically, our primary hand motion, so our right hand in the, sorry, it's backwards. Give me 2 seconds here and I will get this fixed here. Death. Okay, so my primary hand, so my right hand, those first 4 bars, is going to be pretty similar, right? The only difference is I'm closing down the space in the second 2 measures ever so slightly. Okay, so as I play this exercise, it would sound like this. Right. My goal being that I'm trying to keep my primary hand motion as similar as possible, right? So I'm trying to understand how to play these duple double strokes without necessarily compromising my sound or quality, and trying to keep them similar to what my triplet double strokes were, okay? So then in here, the sticking changes ever so slightly. That'd be a right hand, and then we would release on our left hand. All right, so let's try this variation with me. Here we go. All right, and let's do that same exact thing this time with a loop. So this is all into the triplet version, the duple version, back to triplets, and then duple. Okay, here we go. All right, so again, in that process, our goal is that we're trying to keep our hand motion pretty similar here, and we're not trying to change our hand motion drastically to get to the duple double strokes, right? Eventually, we could go back to the first variation, right, which was like this, right, to make sure that our primary hand is still playing that same exact quality of stroke throughout that whole exercise, okay? So let's play this one a few more times. Let's just do this one on a loop, okay, over and over and over again until I stop you. Sorry, let's start over. Here we go. All right, so that's one of the ways I like to try and bridge the gap between what we play in our like triplet exercises from a double beat perspective that has a great, big, rich sound. All of a sudden we get to our duple double strokes and they don't necessarily have that same exact sound, okay? So my next step in kind of building up our foundation is we would play a straight up duple rolls exercise, okay? So one of the exercises that I like to play is here. So this exercise is pretty simple. You've probably done some type of variation on this at some point in time in your life, okay? It's just these first two lines here. Basically, right hand double strokes, left hand double strokes, right hand double strokes, both hands, left hand double strokes, right hand double strokes, left hand double strokes, both hands again, okay? So our goal is that we're kind of getting the same exact double stroke that we were getting in the exercise prior to this one. Okay, let's break this one down just a little bit here. Let's take just the first two measures, all right? Let's take measures 3 and measures 4. Here we go. Let's take measures 5 and measure 6. This is left hand to the right hand. And let's take the last two measures now, measures 7 and 8. let's do the whole exercise, top to bottom. Here we go. All right, so some variations upon this one. Obviously, we can do an inverted sticking, very similar to what we were just doing in our triplet versus duplet exercise, right? That would be right, left, left, right, left, left on the one hands, right? Right, left, right, right on, or sorry, right, left, left on the one hands. Right, left, right on the one andas. So if I were to play this whole exercise inverted, it would kind of sound like this. Okay, and on that right hand double stroke. Okay. So basically, I'm trying to find some parallels to our progression so far, right? Some things that relate to one another, where we can get certain concepts that come across the same exact way, right? With our duple double strokes, again, the biggest thing that I find, especially young performers, is that they have a hard time getting a big sound quality, a big full sound, in comparison to when they do the one-handers, right? The one-handers are usually great, whereas the duple double strokes, not so much. Okay, so those are some ways I kind of build up to those duple double strokes. And obviously, similar to the 8-on-hand exercise we did earlier today, I will be tracking myself from a tempo standpoint, very similar to that, right? Trying to make sure I'm increasing my tempos, because duple double strokes for me, and especially as I get into triplet rolls and things along those lines, you have to be able to play duple double strokes at like extreme tempos like 270, right? And I'll kind of explain how I'm getting to that tempo in a second here, okay? As we move from duple double strokes to triple double strokes. We're going to kind of come back to that in a little bit here. Anybody have any questions so far?
Hi, Derek. We've got a question that Kyle Blair asked on one of the Facebook feeds. And he said, when you're teaching, do you have Logic on your laptop out with you, or do you use an iPad or just downloaded tracks?
Well, I would say it depends on the scenario of like what I'm teaching or where I'm teaching. If I'm teaching in a group setting, I don't necessarily always use those things, but sometimes we do like to get on pads, so we can just hear music just in general and play through music. Especially nowadays, this is very similar to how I would be running a rehearsal, right? So I would throw the track on so we can play to the track, and they would be on their pads at home and things along those lines. But in a group setting, it's usually a little bit harder to do that. I used to have some exercises that I used to put to pop tunes and things along those lines. And basically, it just got to the point where, yes, it was cool, but it was really cool, more cool for the audience than it was for the kids, because with how loud the drums are and trying to compete with the sound system in the drums, it's kind of backwards, if that makes sense from that standpoint. So I like to do a lot of that stuff, especially when I'm doing individual practice or if I'm doing private lessons, right? Because it's probably just me and a pad and another person in a pad, so we can hear the music clearly. But in a full drumline setting, it's more so for the show by the time you get all those things going.
Awesome. That's the only one for the moment.
All right. All right. So I believe you guys did some Michi stuff with Brett last time. We're also going to dig into some Michis, but I'm trying to do it in some different ways than what Brett did here. All right, so here on the screen is Michi's, right? This is Michi's in its typical format, in triplet format, right? But I also have it written out in two other ways here, which is an 8th note format and a 16th note format, okay? So all three of these I kind of utilize more so the first two than the last one, right? Because the second one gets us to a lot of our typical tempos that we kind of have in music nowadays, right? So let's go ahead and start off by playing this check pattern. I'm assuming most of you guys are somewhat familiar with it as you guys play it with Brett. Here we go. So this is the triplet variation. It'll be about this speed. Here we go. Again. All right, so I have some other variations here that I'm going to pull up on the screen. We're going to talk about some paradiddles, okay, and how I kind of break down my paradiddles within Michis here. All right, so I have this exercise broken down into 4 different parts, okay? The 4th part being the actual exercise that we're going to play. So let's start with the 4th part and kind of work our way backwards so we can understand what we've got here. So right here we have the same exact Michis pattern that we had, right? Accents are on 1, 2, 3 for the first 2 bars, right? And then 1, 2, 4, second 2 bars, 1, 3, 4, right? And then finally 2, 3, 4. Right. So my accent pattern is exactly the same. If I were to just play Michi's accents, it would sound like this, right? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 4, 1, 3, 4, 1, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 2, 3, 4, 1. Okay? All that is exactly the same. All right. I'm just putting everything in duple form, right? And obviously we have paradiddles here. Okay. So this is our paradiddle variation. I'll just go ahead and play it for you one time. Right? So basically, I'm just going to be taking notes away to get to our check patterns, right? So this first pattern is just our drag, right? Or just our diddle. This is part 3, right? Right? As I move to part 2, it's just our alternating strokes, or our para, right? And then part 1, it brings us all the way down to our bare bones, which is just our 8th notes, right? Okay. So I like to use a particular analogy of a Christmas tree, okay? And basically, our Christmas tree, during Christmas, you guys would go up to the top of a mountain, right? And you would find the best tree that you possibly could. You would bring it down the mountain, you would put it down in your house, and you would just leave it. No, you'd probably decorate it, right? So you want to put a lot of ornaments in your trees, whether it's lights or popcorn, candy canes, whatever you put on your particular Christmas tree, right? Does not change the Christmas tree itself, right? It's still the exact same Christmas tree that you trekked all the way up the mountain to grab to put into your house, okay? So my Christmas tree in this analogy is going to be this check pattern right here, okay? So part 1 is the Christmas tree. As I get to parts 2, 3, and 4, I'm just thinking about it as if I'm adding ornaments onto my Christmas tree, but I want to make sure that my Christmas tree stays exactly the same throughout. So no matter what, as I get to part 4, I need to still have part 1 apparent in my hands, right? So if I'm playing part 1, I want to make sure that is still there as I get to part 4. Right, so I'm trying to make sure that my 8th notes still line up that same exact way, okay? So I'm going to use that analogy here as we kind of get into some of the more advanced music in general. But just kind of want to show you some different ways that we can add some Michi's patterns that aren't necessarily always in that triplet format. All right, my next one is one of my favorites. Let me make sure I have the right one.
Derrick, while we're working on this, what kind of age groups do you use these various Michi variations with?
I think that Michi's for me is a pretty uh, not necessarily age group specific, but more so an exercise that any age group could use it kind of thing. Okay. This pattern right here, like as I look at duple triple Michis, the one I just pulled out, that's definitely something that I could work on with like sixth graders, right? Or some of my beginners and things along those lines. Basically just talking about how to get through eighth notes and triplets, right? As I get to some of my more advanced passages, I mean, the other day I was doing a Michi's pattern that was like flam drags on the first two counts. And then after that, we had like a drag and then two flam taps. So something along like the lines of this. And we were taking that pattern and we were putting it through Michi's, right? So as we get to the second bar, and that's something that doesn't necessarily seem like it's Michi's, but it's still within that same check pattern. So it's something I like to use for the majority of my students, all the way from the beginners to the more advanced kids. And it's really just dependent upon what patterns we're working on, which makes it more basic or makes it more advanced from that standpoint.
Sweet. And is there, just real quick too, because people are going to want to know, is there a way for people to access these files?
Yes, I can put them all into like a Dropbox folder or something along those lines and send me away after this.
Okay, cool.
All right, so this is duple triple Michi, right? We're going to go all the way back down to our part 4 to kind of look at what our goal is as we get to this pattern, right? I love this one a lot because, you know, this is one of the things that people start to talk about, like how do you play your triple rolls versus your duple rolls and how do you change pressure in your hand and things along those lines. So this is an exercise that I like to use that goes through how we talk about pressure in the hand and things like that, okay? So this last pattern, I'll go ahead and play it for you and we'll kind of talk about it a little bit. Okay, so obviously we have two completely different types of rolls, right? We have high duple rolls and we have lower triplet rolls. And basically we want to make sure that we can get through this exercise without having to change or without having to have a ton of different techniques, okay? In music today, we play so many different things right in a row without necessarily having time to like change our hands or set our hands differently and things along those lines. So I like to think about, again, that egg analogy, right? Having even pressure throughout my whole hand and trying to have a pretty universal grip, right? So I'm not trying to work on like different techniques for different things. I'm trying to work on how do I get my grip to work for everything, if that makes sense. And there are some variations. There are some times where maybe I do have a little more pressure towards the front of the hand or a little more pressure in the back of the hand, right? And this exercise, I think, is great to talk about those things, okay? For example, these duple rolls, I'm probably going to do more wrist turn with those, right? And maybe have a little more pressure in the back of the hand, right? To make them nice and beefy, right? As we get to the triplet rolls, I'm probably not going to turn my wrist as much, right? But I'm going to use more of a large lever, right? Which is my entire forearm to help get those triple rolls out. But I'm going to try not to pinch off the front of the hand too much because that is definitely a tendency as people start to play faster rolls is they want to pinch off the front of the hand, which kind of chokes off the sound and makes it very thin, okay? So I'm going to think about trying to keep more pressure in the middle of the hand for the triplet rolls, right? While using that large lever. And then as for the duple rolls, doing a lot of wrist turn and thinking about maybe a little more pressure in the back of the hand, okay? So it's not anything that's necessarily calculated like duple roll, triple roll, duple roll, triple roll, and they do cross over quite a bit, okay? But that's just a general thing that I think about as I tend to play this exercise, okay? So as I play it again, I'll kind of explain that some more. So you can especially see, especially on going back and forth between the duple roll and triplet roll, you can see the motion change in my wrist versus my forearm, right? And that's one of the most important things to making sure we get a great sound quality out of both of these things, is that we understand where the motion is coming from, either from the wrist or the large lever, right? As we get to faster and more choppy things, we use a lot more large lever, right? And we use a lot less wrist, right? As we get to some of the easier things with more space, we probably want to turn our wrist considerably more because, again, that's our primary motivator, okay? So as we move backwards now into this exercise, we just take off some of those things. And we have that same Christmas tree analogy, right? Our Christmas tree is purely just our rhythm, eighth notes and triplets. Right? As we continue on, we make this a two-guided exercise. In the beginning, we'll probably play this all up in part one, right? As we get to part two, we just bring the triplets down. Right? Thinking about a lot of things we talked about in our one-handed exercise for two heights, which is making sure that we're just choosing how much to turn our wrist back and not necessarily squeezing the stick to get from those accents to those inner beats, right? And then we start to add the triplet roll, which I think is a great variation because it really teaches us how to negotiate space but density at the same time and how to get back and forth between those two hand motions. Okay, and then obviously we get to our last pattern, but there's one more pattern we could do, which would be duple rolls and no triplet rolls, which would sound like this. Okay. So again, this is just kind of a way to kind of show you some different variations that we can do with Michis that aren't necessarily always in that triplet format. Anybody have any questions on any of those?
Do you find that this helps with like rhythmic spacing and stuff like that too, especially going between the like taking the doubles into the singles and stuff like that in it?
Yes, definitely for sure. And again, this is one of the exercises that even from the very beginning, I mean, going from eighth notes to triplets is something that everybody needs to know how to do, from a sixth grader all the way through a professional musician. So it's something that I would keep in my repertoire throughout my entire life and not necessarily say, oh, I've moved past being able to play eighth notes and triplets, right? Because there's so many different things from a hand standpoint, so many different things from a mental standpoint that can get us from that metric modulation and making sure that it's as perfect as can be. All right. So I'm going to talk about how I get to my triplet rolls from my duple rolls here real quick. And I'm going to use a little bit of math. I'm sure you guys all love math. This is the favorite part of the day because I get to share my calculator, actually.
Well, while you're doing calculus, Hudson Dunbar says, I remember staying up late last summer on tour with two buds trying to show me Michis. They were doing a lot of great variations, but I can't remember how we were putting triplet grid stuff through Michis. And he said, how can we do that on the triplet version?
On the triplet version, I mean, it's just basically adding variations to the triplet. So for example, we could take tap drags, right? And we just put a drag after every accent, right? And it would just sound like this. We could put a flam on every accent. We could try that. Obviously, we could do both of those, which is flam drags. Right? We could change things like, let's say, the two counters. So we have two, the accented beat and the unaccented beat. That's what I like to call my two counters. Maybe we put flam taps on those, right? So I would have two flam drags and then three flam taps, and etc. Right? So basically, it's just anything that you can come up with, anything that you can think of, you can put in Michis, right? You can do it with different rhythms. It doesn't necessarily always have to be triplets, right? Like, for example, the duple to triple Michis, right? Or we get to our two counters, our triplets, and everything else are eighth notes. We could add fivelets in there. We could do fivelets for the entire thing if we wanted to. So there's so many different variations you can add to Michis. And basically, it's just coming up with whatever you need to work on and figuring out the best way to kind of build that up.
Sweet. All right, now back to the calculus.
All right, so this is the only time that I like to talk about math and music because I think that a lot of people use a ton of math, especially in drumline when it comes to heights and, you know, is it 3, 6, 9, 12 and things along those lines. And I think that it becomes less musical than I like it to be. But this is more so a teaching tool that I like to use. So let's take duple rolls, okay? I'm going to throw my metronome on 180. Because we're going to say that we already got our duple rolls up to 180. And I would play that same exercise we just played a little bit ago, which goes like this. Right, so I'm basically telling myself that I have great duple rolls, right? But I'm trying to get my triplet rolls to sound just as good as my duple rolls, okay? So I'm going to take 180. I'm going to divide that by 3, and I'm going to multiply it times 2, which gives me 120, okay? So then I'm going to go ahead and put my metronome on 120. And when I do that, my hand motion is basically just changed to triplets. Okay, so sorry. If I'm taking my triple rolls exercise, let's say that we're doing or some variation along those lines. So we're going to go. Okay, so I'm going to start that at my 180 in duple form. So I'm playing 8th notes and 16th notes. Okay. Divide that by 3, multiply it times 2. That gives me 120. Same exact hand motion, different feeling, right? Okay. My goal is to get the exercise to sound and feel exactly the same. Okay. So this is one of the reasons why I talked about trying to get our duple rolls so high from a tempo standpoint. I would bump, let's say, I was at 180 just now. Bump 12 clicks. I'm at 192 and play that same exercise. Right? If I go back to my calculator, 192 divided by 3 times 2 gives me 128. Put my metronome on 128. Same exact hand motion. I'm going to try and make it sound exactly the same as we just did. Okay, and basically I would take that all the way through. Every 12 clicks at the fast tempo equals 8 clicks at the slow tempo. Okay, so if you don't want to do all the math, you can just kind of think about it that way, right? So if my fast tempo is 192, I add another 12 clicks, right? Which gets me to 204. Adding another 8 clicks at the slower tempo would give me a 136, and those two tempos correlate to the same hand motion. Okay. The reason I like to do this, and I like to do this for a lot of things that are more technical, especially when we get to faster triplet rhythms or faster 5-lit rhythms, right? Is I'm basically teaching myself the spacing of all these notes by going back to the first thing we ever learned, right? The first thing you ever learned were probably 1/8 notes and quarter notes and whole notes. Everything was always in duple, right? So when we get to these triplets, we start to lose how we negotiate space sometimes, and we start to lose some quality, right? So breaking it down this way, I think, really helps a ton with from an understanding standpoint of making sure that we are playing the correct spacing between notes, especially as we start to add all the flams and double strokes and things along those lines. Okay, so that's one way that I kind of break down the gap between my duple rolls to my triplet rolls.
Okay, so the math is breaking a few people's brains. So can you go back through just one more time how you did just real quickly, how you did the division from getting from like one tempo to the other, just so that people can like get one more pass at that?
Yep, so if we're going from 1/8 notes to triplets, you're always going to divide by 3, and you're going to multiply times 2, okay? So if I take my 180 again, I'm playing duple rolls at 180. Right? I take that number, I divide it by 3, and multiply it times 2 every single time. Okay, so I'm divided by 3, multiply it times 2. That gives me my 120. And then that will give us our triplet hand motion. Right? So that's kind of the easy way to do it. Just always thinking about dividing by 3, multiplying times 2. I would maybe write that down because that's the easiest way to understand how to get that metric modulation if you just have something to look at and say, oh, that's what I'm supposed to do. But the most important aspect of that is making sure that our hand motions stays exactly the same, feels the same, sounds the same, etc.
And do you ever do that the other direction?
Yes, definitely. So if we have like a triplet passage that we want to break down in duple form, I would do the same exact thing, trying to get that, actually, we're getting ready to do that here in a second in a more complicated passage. So I will show you there. All right, so right here is a piece of music that I've written. And basically, we have some faster triplet passages here that I'll kind of explain how to break down that same exact way. Okay. Um, so I'll start off by kind of playing this lick. It's been a little bit since I've played this, so let me make sure I got it in my hands. Okay, so that's like a 5-bar passage there. The last measure is a 2/4 measure. Okay, so I'll play it one more time. All right. So I'm going to take that same exact thing and talk about how to break it down like we just did, all right, from duple to triple. I believe our goal tempo for this is 180, right? So that's cooking. That's pretty fast, right? If I go to 180, right? So it's not the slowest thing, right? So that's something that we would definitely want to be able to break down and make sure that we can kind of get to that tempo and make sure that we have great quality in doing it, okay? So if I have my triplets now, one thing that I could do is I would start maybe at a slow tempo, right? And just trying to play that exercise at a slow tempo. So maybe I do start that at 120, right? Which is really, really slow. But just to kind of get an understanding of trying to play it slow, right? All right, so now I'm at my 120, practicing it nice and slow, okay? I'm just gonna do the opposite of what I did before, right? Which take that 120, multiply it times 2. Sorry, 120. 120 divided by 2 and multiplied times 3, right? Which would get us to 180. So it works the same way in both ways. So then if I were to play this play this chunk at 180, I'm going to play it in duple form, which would be the same exact hand motion that I had when it was triplets at 120. Okay. So for example, now I'm just playing 1 and a 2, 1 and a 2 and, or 1 and a 2 and a 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and, right? Which is a much more simple rhythm. We could play that all day long, right? 1 and a 2 and a 3 and. So I'm gonna take that same exact thing, play in duple form at 180, right? Which sounds like this, right? Same exact hand motion that we had before when we were at our 120. Going back to our 180, it should feel and sound exactly the same, right? So one of the things that always helps my students, I feel like, is to write it out. Either have them write it out in duple form, or to write it out yourself and hand it out to them in duple form. Okay, because I think that gives them a better understanding of exactly the spacing between the notes and things along those lines. Because especially as we get to those fast tempos, we're at 180. We're just trying to survive at that point, as opposed to making sure that we're having great quality in everything that we are doing. Okay, so I'm going to show you that same exact process. But it's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to show you in 5-lit form here. So the phrase right before this, that you can see at letter G here, has a ton of 5-lits. Okay. So this is something that somebody might look at the first time and they'd be like, well, I have no idea how to play this. I don't even know where to start. It's a meter that I'm not necessarily comfortable with. I haven't really played a ton of 5/8 before in my life. How do I break this down? What do I do? Okay. So I'm going to take a similar process to what we did before. Our goal tempo for this is 180, right? So instead of our numbers being 3 and 2, our numbers just become 5 and 4, right? So if I'm at 180, divided by 5 times 4, right, gives us 144. So playing this at eighth notes in 180, right? So everything is in like 5/4. We're going 1 and 2 and a 3 and 4 and 5 and, right? And that first measure, those eighth notes become 5/8 at 144. Okay. So if I were to play this first measure, that's me playing all eighth notes at 180, right? Take that same exact thing, bring it down to 144. Now my hand motion stays exactly the same, but everything is in 5/8. But it's the same exact hand motion, same exact feeling that I had at my 180. Sorry. Okay, so the process is exactly the same in this scenario. Just changes the numbers that we're working with since we're working from 5/8, trying to get that to duple form. Okay, so again, that number is 180 divided by 4 times 5. Sorry, 180 divided by 5 times 4, which gets us down to that 144. Okay. Did I confuse you guys with math? But everybody in the room is like, I'm a music major. I only know how to count to 4. Anything past that?
No, I think that helped. There's several people on the chat are talking about wanting to try doing some of that with their students, and so that was why I was wanting to make sure that we had it pretty clear as to how the math worked.
Yeah, and basically these are just metric modulations, right? We're just changing how we feel a piece of music, although our hands are playing it the exact same way. Okay. Now, one of the most important aspects of this process is making sure that we are starting at slower tempos and progressively bringing it up over the course of time, right? Obviously, our goal tempo is to play something like this as written at 180, right? But that might not happen for a few weeks, right? Now, in the scenario of being in class or being in drum corps or indoor or wherever you're at, you'll probably do a lot of trying to play it at tempo where you're just surviving, right? But as we start to break these things down in this way, understanding how to put these things in duple form, that's where I feel like my students start to have a much higher understanding of these, not only the rhythms, but how easy some of these things might actually be, right? Because it might look complicated on the page, but by the time we get going, they understand the correlation between the two, and it becomes much more simple. So they have a much better understanding of it.
You mentioned that sometimes it's easier to give them it written out in the other variation. How often would you say you do that?
For example, like let's say that we had this for an indoor show or something like that, or in drum corps, I probably would have it written out one of those very first rehearsals, ideally, because that's when we're going to start talking about how to break it down. Especially drum corps and the activity that we do is the worst because we always talk about breaking things down first, as opposed to trying to do a full run of something, right? So we get the whole scope of everything. But we would probably try and play the whole thing so we get the whole scope of what is point A to point B to all the way to Z and things along those lines. And then we start breaking down a chunk like this. That's probably the first time I would talk about the duple format and things along those lines. I'd probably start off by just explaining it and trying to get everybody to understand the math, understand that, and things along those lines. And then as another resource later on, I would probably, within a few rehearsals, get it written out and then get it out to them so they can kind of really see it with their eyes for those visual learners.
All right, cool.
Any other questions on that process?
Not at the moment.
All right, so we are going to head back over to Michi's.
You definitely win for most math talked about on one of these.
And again, this is one of the only times I ever talk about math. I hate talking about math from a musical standpoint, but I think that it's something that's really great for breaking things down and getting better understanding of everything. All right. From the question earlier, we talked a little bit about how to put some more things in Michis. On the screen here, I just have some more Michis variations. All of these are roll variations in this first page, right? We start off with just the check. Obviously, we have downbeat drags, downbeat fives, right? So there's so many different variations that you could do. I just have quite a few variations in this packet so that people can kind of get a grasp for what some of those smaller basic variations are. So all those are roll variations. Now, Michis for me is something that, again, is very universal, right? And I like to work on a lot of different aspects with them. So some of the other variations I do are timing variations, right? So we have like our one-hander timing, we have upbeat timing, things along those lines. So it's still that same exact Michis pattern. We're just kind of moving and taking notes out as opposed to adding notes, which we would typically do as we add flams and drags and things along those lines, okay? So let's go ahead and take a look at this first one here, okay? So basically on our unaccented beat and the beat before that is where we have a chord note triplet. Okay. Everything else, all of our other accented beats, our first two accented beats in the first measure are all just normal triplets. Okay. Eighth note triplets. So this is what it would sound like. Okay. Another way you can kind of think about it is think about where the chord note triplet starts. And the first measure starts on count 3. The second measure starts on count 2. Third time we get to the pattern, it starts on count 1. And the last one's on count 4. So you can kind of think about it that way too. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. 4, 1, 2. 4, 1. 3, 4, 1. 3, 4. 3, 4. 2, 3, 4, 1. Okay. So let's go ahead and try and play this variation together. Here we go. Here we go, same thing. Oop. Almost dropped my stick there. All right, let's go on to the next pattern. So this is upbeat timing. Somewhat similar, right? But instead of this time, we are taking the secondary hand in this as opposed to the primary hand, right? Right. And there's so many different patterns. Like I said before, we get into two-note pattern, or two-note timing pattern, right? Which we have timing patterns similar to this that kind of sound like this. Right, we have patterns and exercises that we've grown up with that are very similar to that. Basically, I'm just taking them and I'm putting them within Michis. So there's so many different patterns that you can do. Doesn't necessarily always have to be within that same exact rhythm structure. Maybe there's, for whatever reason, we want to add some 16th notes in one of these timing patterns. So maybe we do 16th notes right before we get to the timing pattern. So we do something like that, right? It just all depends on what we're trying to work on. If we're trying to work on our hand speed changes and things along those lines while still having space and understanding how to negotiate space, that's something that I would definitely kind of put in there. And then as we get to the bottom of the page here, we get back to our duple triple Michi pattern that we had a full page for on that we talked about a little bit earlier. Here's a page of flams, right? We talked about how to just put them on our normal track pattern, right? So this first one is Flam Accents. And the first time we play it without the flam. Second time we play it with the flam, right? So it's no accent, no accent, no accent, flam, 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 right? Or sorry, no flam, not necessarily no accent. So no flam, no flam, no flam, 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 right? And that's just a nice way to kind of get started into playing flam accents just in general, okay? Here's the Flam Tap Variation that we talked about earlier. Where basically on that same two counter thing I talked about before, where we had the chord note triplet on, we're adding flam taps now, right? So basically it goes like this. Right? Let's just see if we can play that one together. We'll go a little bit slower here and just see if we can play it. Here we go. All right, so basically throughout all of this, it's basically taking a concept of gridding, right? Which everybody probably knows, 16th note grid, triplet grid, things along those lines. Those have been like our typical gridding exercises that we would have, like 16th note grid here, right? And then also triplet grid. Typically, we're used to gridding things like that where we move the accent around, okay? So I really like Michi's because the accent always stays on the downbeat, which I think helps, especially a lot of younger performers, in truly trying to understand a concept, right? One of the things that everybody likes to grid in triplet grid is flam drags, right? So going from right, everybody likes to grid flam drags. If I were to take that same exact thing and leave the accents all on the downbeat, right, and just kind of shift over what that flam drag actually is, it would kind of sound like this. That would be the first variation. Second variation will be drag on the downbeat, right? Third variation would be the accent on the downbeat, and then a flam, a low flam, and then a double stroke. All right, so basically I'm taking triplet grid flam drags, and putting it so that our accent is always on the downbeat. And the third variation. That makes sense to everybody? And that's kind of what Michi's does, is takes our typical grid and puts it in a format to where people can understand things more because it's just straight up downbeat accents, right?
And I assume that you find that that's a lot easier for students to understand than just the straight up grid.
Yes, I typically find that a lot easier to understand. Grid for me, especially for younger students, ends up being more of a timing thing, right? Because we're trying to understand how to fit the feet on the downbeats, which is usually pretty easy, and then trying to understand how to go do ga, do ga, do ga, do ga with the feet, and then doom da da da, which a lot of times can be very difficult, especially for a younger kid, right? And if we're trying to work on something that's very simple, right, we don't necessarily need to work on the timing just yet. We might want to just have accents on the downbeat, but have a way that we can kind of move some things around and grid things that they can understand a little bit better. So that's one of the reasons why I like Michi's, because that gives us a better understanding of the simple things, right? But we can also still use it for more complicated things as well, obviously, right? Eventually I would definitely take those same exact things and I would put them in grid, and you would definitely see that in like a drum corps audition or an indoor audition where we would play, you know, some grid variations and things along those lines from straight up triplet grid and straight up 16th note grid.
Cool. I think the other thing I like about the Michi's thing is it becomes sort of a shopping spree kind of thing because you can fit about anything into it.
Yeah, the possibilities are definitely endless. You can do anything you want within Michi's for sure. There's one more thing I want to do here. Here it is. So I know I talk a lot about trying to bridge the gap between one concept and another concept, right? We talked about that in double beat, trying to get our double beat to bridge over to our duple rolls, right? We talked about how to bridge our duple rolls to our triplet rolls. This is another exercise that I use to really make our triple rolls sound beefier, right? And more so like our duple rolls, right? So this exercise right here, I like to call it upbeat triplet rolls because we are trying to find the upbeat within a triplet roll. Okay, so a lot of times people think about triple rolls as a triplet hand motion, bagada bagada, right? And then add double strokes on that to get a triple roll, right? I like to think about them more as if we had eighth notes all the way throughout. Okay, so a lot of times we play like an eighth note triple roll exercise, kind of like we did in duple triple michis, where we go. Right, with the goal of that basically being that we can hear the eighth notes throughout. So this exercise does exactly that. So as I play these first two bars, right, we're basically stopping on where those upbeats are. So that second note in the left hand or the second note in the right hand on those double strokes are the upbeat. Okay, so I would probably start this one somewhere around 120 or so. Okay, and let's go ahead and play the first two bars, just like this. Here we go. All right, let's take the next two bars, which is just basically one counters, right? We did two counters before. This is one counters. Just the next two bars. This is measures 3 and 4. All right, and let's play the first four bars now. First four bars. I just put my eighth note on my metronome just to make sure that we are still aligning the second note of those double strokes with that eighth note. There we go. First four bars. Okay, now we get into our actual triple roll variation, right? Which in this exercise is written out as 6 tuplets, just so we can see exactly where those eighth notes still lie throughout this. Okay, so looking at our first measure here and our second, or first measure of the second line, we see that the first two beats are exactly the same. As we get into our 6 tuplets, we are still trying to line the upbeat on this note, which is the same exact as this one, right? And this note, which is the exact same as this one. Okay, so that's our goal. So let's play just measures 5 and measure 6. Right, so it'll sound just like this. That much. So the goal of this is that we're not necessarily thinking about triplets throughout, right? We're not trying to think, but instead we're trying to think, right, to keep that duple form throughout, okay? So let's go ahead and play the whole exercise all the way down, right? Again, trying to focus on hearing that eighth note within the triplet roll. So as I'm playing the second half of this exercise, I'm thinking about it as even though my sticking doesn't necessarily stay that. Okay? Here we go. All the way down. All right. So as I'm playing that, can everybody hear the eighth note within the six tuplets, right? And how I'm trying to get the point across that we're trying to listen for that eighth note throughout, as opposed to making sure that we just play the hand motion, right? So that's one of the exercises I like to use to really beef up triple rolls, and I think that this is always something I like to play early season, right? We might not necessarily have a ton of time to play it late season, but it's something that I think really opens up a lot of eyes as to how we can get a nice, big, beefy triple roll quality out of our triple rolls, right? Instead of thinking about just how do we create double strokes off of this hand motion, we think about the actual rhythm, right? And making sure that we're playing great rhythm and great sounds out of both hands. Any questions on that concept?
No, I think that's all great because one of the biggest issues that I think people run into is they spend a lot of time working on these exercises and stuff, but then getting the students to be able to understand how to relate that to how they play other things. You know, like when you mentioned the double beat, but then they play with really weak rolls because they don't make that connection. I think all these exercises like this are really good for kind of bridging that.
Yeah, and I think that's something that's a really important concept just in general. A lot of us play exercises because that's what we played growing up, right? Like, oh yeah, we started off with eights every day, then we played accent tap, and we played double beat. But we might not necessarily know the why behind why we're playing those exercises and what they're doing to make us better and things along those lines. Okay. Um, the first year I started at the high school that I'm currently teaching at, which is about 4 years ago now. We were an A class drumline in WJI, and this group did not make state finals in their state finals, and they were one and done at WJI. They went to prelims, and then they were done after that. My first year with them, we had three exercises. We had an ACE exercise, an accent tap exercise. Those are kind of combined together. And then we had a double V exercise and we had a roll exercise. And those are the only things we played. And we really focused on trying to make sure that everybody had a huge understanding of what those exercises did and how they correlated to the music, right? So with that, we were able to take that group that did make state finals the year before and, you know, was one and done at WJI finals to winning WJI finals in A class that very first year that we were with the program. And it was mainly because of how we broke down those exercises and made sure that they were working on just the things that they need to work on to accomplish the things we needed them to accomplish. So in that first year, we didn't play, I don't think, any triple rolls. I don't even think we played any triple rolls in the second year when we were in open class finals. So I think a lot of it was just making sure that everybody had a great understanding of those fundamental aspects, which a lot of times isn't necessarily, you know, the fact that you can play eight on hand or the fact that you can play accent tap or double beat or rolls, but it's how you do those things. It's understanding how your hands need to move throughout those things. It's understanding what kind of sounds you need to create, and then ultimately making those things transfer over to the show, right? Which is the end all be all goal, right? So that's why I like to talk about a lot of how we bridge the gap from one concept to the next, and we move on to the next thing, to the next thing. But at the end of the day, our Christmas tree, which is what we started with, which is, you know, our basic sound production or our basic rhythm, whatever it is, stays exactly the same as we continue to add more and more to our foundation.
Yeah, that's cool. I think I would assume that you would say too that it has to do also with like at the varying levels that you're going to be at, knowing what the skill set is that you're going to need, and making sure that you've kind of tailored your program around that too, so that they make sure they get those concepts. Would that be accurate, you think?
Yes, definitely. Now, the packet that I have here that we use tonight is just kind of a general packet that I use throughout. But like that first year at Plainfield, we were doing some things that were even more basic than what's in this packet. And even what we started with, we kind of figured that we needed to do things that were even more basic than that to some extent. So sometimes it's, you know, especially like let's talk about how we get from accent tap, right? We play all these one-handed exercises like the one I showed you, right? But we never play hardly anything like that in any music, right? If we play accent tap in music, it's like some eighth note pattern like this, or some triplet pattern like this. Very rarely, unless we're playing like a street beat, do we see a 16th note pattern like, right? So in order to bridge that gap, we would play things like quarter note accent tap, right? Because if we are playing a lot of eighth notes like this with a beat here, our hand motion needs to be this. Right, which is quarter notes to our feet. Maybe we're at like 180. So that's something that's even more simple than the eighth note exercise that we were doing before. So a lot of times it's figuring out exactly what you want those kids to be able to do, right? And breaking it down in the most basic aspect that you possibly can. And I would definitely say that this is a very tedious process sometimes, but it's very, 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 very worth it in the end. It's one of those things to where even your students at times, it might be hard to get them to stay engaged, right? But to come up with different variations and come up with different things they need to think about, I think helps a ton because it's not always about playing the exercise. A lot of times it's, is your pinky finger on? Are you squeezing the stick too much? Are you having too much pressure on the stick? Are you thinking about the egg analogy, right? Does it look effortless? Can we phrase while we do this? Can we do this with a basics block at the same time? So there are tons of things that you can add on to it that are still focusing on that very basic thing without having to go to a more complex pattern, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, because I think I notice that a lot of groups will do exercises because they've seen groups do exercises, so they feel like they need to do those exercises, even though it doesn't necessarily relate to what they're actually doing.
Correct. And I think that's a great example of just what the drumline world is, right? But I always think that for me, every single exercise program that I have is always tailored to whatever group of kids that I have at that given time. There are some things that remain the same, right? Like we're going to play some type of legato exercise, we're going to play a double beat, we're going to play rolls, right? But what variations we play within that? I mean, I think I was looking at, let me see if I can find it here real quick. I was looking at our duper rolls exercise from that first year at playing field I was talking about. And it was like a variation that was just, it was a very long exercise, but it was literally something along the lines of this. Right, and then we do left hand variation, right, and then we do both hands. Whereas we could have just done the exercise that we played today, which was right. We could have done that exercise, but I wanted to be able to focus more on one specific thing before they had to focus on changing hands and things along those lines. So I think it's always, for me, especially like in bass drummers in general, right? Bass drummers, it's great if you can play the snare drum part, because that's ultimately the goal. We want you to be, just as accomplished as a snare drummer, right? You're not necessarily lower on the totem pole or anything like that. I played bass drum for 5 years in drum corps, right? But for younger bass drummers, they can't necessarily always play the same exact thing that a snare drummer can. So it's okay for them to play like a quarter note variation and accent tap, right? So they understand the concept of accent tap. Whereas the snare drummers and the quad drummers might be hacking away an eighth note variation, right? It might be a little bit too fast for those bass drummers. So I like to do some things where we might just literally have some strokes where we just play quarter notes, quarter, 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 and we're just focusing on rebounding out to this position, this parallel position, because that might be something that they need to work on. So it's not necessarily always, here's an exercise, let's play it, right? 9 times out of 10, and probably 10 times out of 10 for me, it's always, what do we need to accomplish, and how do we fit that within an exercise?
Awesome. So we've got a couple of questions that have popped up here, and they're slightly related. Anthony Samuel said, what are some of the things you consider when plotting the progression of a line from the start of the season to the end?
So this is something I think about a lot, actually. In general, when I think about drumline, or I think about like Plainfield High School, for example, I think about where I need them at WGI finals, and then I basically back that all the way up to this time of year, which is the summer, right? What are those concepts we're going to need to know? What are those things we're going to need to drum, right? A lot of times I might have like a rhythmic motif, and we'll play that rhythmic motif throughout the entire year, right? That very first year, our rhythmic motif was something that was like a 1-2 rhythm. So we played a lot of, things along those lines. So I wrote that same exact motif in the fall book so that we would be able to play those types of things and we'd be able to learn those types of things. There are actually some times where the tempo was the same or similar, and I put those same exact licks in the winter book because they fit. Okay. Now it's not something that I would advise trying to like, okay, let me make sure that this fall lick fits in my winter book. But there are some things that can definitely be relatable, especially if the music is somewhat similar. Okay, so I like to plan my entire year out and make sure that we are working on the things we need to work on to make them great for WGI finals. So there might be some exercises that we're playing that don't necessarily help with our fall book necessarily, but we're playing them to prepare ourselves for what the winter is going to be. So once our marching band season is over, they're not seeing something for the first time that's going to be really difficult for them in the winter.
Yeah, I think that's cool because a lot of times when we talk even to students about like learning a piece, like if I've got a student that's preparing a piece for a recital or something like that, I'll tell them figure out when your recital is, when is your hearing going to be, and like kind of start to break things down like in the retrograde that way to figure out where you got to be and how you're going to get there. And I feel like sometimes we do the inverse when it comes to marching seasons and stuff like that, where we start with, okay, here's where we are today, and now we're just going to kind of take it day by day as we go, instead of necessarily having it planned out from, this is where I need to be, now how am I going to get there?
So I do have an example here pulled up of a warm-up sequence that I use for a high school I used to teach at. And basically, it starts off like we just talked about, right? This is WGI finals, so this is basically the end goal, right? But moving all the way back to the beginning of the summer season, we were playing things in this same framework, but they were much more simple. Okay. As we move forward into time, we're able to take a pattern. Let's say that maybe one of our patterns is we're playing accent tap. We're going. And that might be what we play in the fall, right? And as we get into the winter, we might have something more complex, like you'll kind of see in this video, where we get to a pattern that's kind of like this. But that's not necessarily the pattern that we would start with in the fall, right? Because that'd probably be something that's way above their heads for everybody to understand right away. This also kind of goes back to kind of the playing to pop music and things along those lines, where we used to do a ton of that for some of our warm-ups. So basically, we had these warm-ups and these exercises that could put anything into them that you needed to play. Same thing in the front ensemble, right? We might have some things that we're working on a single independent stroke or something like that. And it might be quarter notes in the fall, right? And then maybe we move to quarter note triplets in the winter, and then maybe eventually we get to 16th notes or something along those lines. So this is kind of the progression where it ended. And again, it starts off as something that is definitely much more simple than what it is there. Sorry, I don't think I shared the audio. Oh, I did. Thumbs up if you guys can hear this. early season, some of these patterns might be the same exact pattern over and over and over and over again. It's still like the same length, so we can play what essentially is the chart or the tune. And as we progress on, we might say, okay, we have this one thing taken care of. It's starting to sound pretty good. Okay, let's change it up and let's add this variation. Let's kind of get this. So this is one of the ways I've found that has helped keep things very interesting for the kids, especially when we talk about basic concepts. I mean, we can sit there and we can play the C major scale over and over again for days and days and days. At some point in time, the kids are going to get somewhat bored with it if we don't keep it engaging. So this is one of the things I found has been really fun for my kids. So we all have some type of exercise that's about this length, maybe a little bit shorter depending on the year, what we're working on. And they all have specific skill sets. There's nothing in here that's like, this is just fun. Until we get to later in the year where we have like a stop time section that we added on. We're like, it's cool, it's fun, this is for the kids. So we had a section where they just really play one a few times before they got back into the tune, which I think was really cool for them, but also so for example, we talked about those single independents and the marimbas there. We would start that as like a much slower pattern, like maybe they were playing quarter notes time of year in the summer, knowing that our goal is to get this by the end. And I do think that in general, especially for me, one thing that I think that a lot of people underestimate is how much better kids can get in an entire year. Because you'll be sitting there at band camp and you'll be like, man, we're so bad. I don't know what to do. We're not going to be able to get there. We're not going to be able to make it. And I've seen kids, I mean, even as I think about like this group in particular, think about where they were at band camp and think about what they were able to accomplish by the end of the year, you would never think that it's like the same kid but the same performer.
And is this fairly common for you to have the pit and the battery kind of combined into the warm-up sequence?
Yes, it's actually very common. For me, when I was actually teaching at this high school, this is in Goshen, Indiana, which is not necessarily near any major cities. It's about 2 hours from Chicago, 3 hours from Indianapolis. The closest major city is South Bend, Indiana, which isn't as major as, like Chicago and Indianapolis, for example. But I was the only instructor there, and I had no other choice. I had to have the front ensemble and the battery play together. So I think that's exactly how this concept of playing these tunes kind of originated, because that's all I could do. I had to play the battery and the front ensemble together. I had to teach Susie how to play her four mallet at the same time I taught Johnny how to rotate his left wrist on snare drum. So coming up with things that we could play together and still get all those concepts across was kind of difficult for me in the beginning, and this is the best way that I found to do it. But also, now as I get to the more advanced groups, I think it's great for them as well, because we're constantly getting our ensemble ears going. We're constantly playing together. Up north here in the winter, all of our warm-ups are indoors, right? It's in a band room or in a gym somewhere. So we have to kind of fight the battery and the front ensemble. The battery's facing that direction, playing triplet rolls. The front ensemble's facing that direction, trying to play some block chords. And we're just like fighting each other, as opposed to why don't we just play these things together, right? In a format that's cool and fun and hip for the kids, so that we don't have to necessarily fight each other, but we're also working on that ensemble timing at the same time.
Yeah, I think that's good, because there's a lot of groups that they only have one instructor, but they don't always put the two sections together, and so like one section ends up not getting the attention that they need or something like that. So I think it's good for groups to think about combining things more that way.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Sorry. One more question that we've got. Brent Rippey wants to know if you have any tips on how you build your culture in the middle to high school levels.
So culture building is a big one. I would say we probably spend more time talking about how to build a culture than we do actually playing the drums sometimes. And it's definitely something that's built over the course of time. It's not something to where you can come into a program and all of a sudden the culture is great and it's awesome and everything is phenomenal, right? I would say typically around my third or so year with the program is where the culture starts to really feel pretty natural for the kids, and they understand what to expect from me. They understand what to expect from each other. And I think, especially in today's world, I mean, so many crazy things are going on between COVID and, I mean, the reason we're here online is because of COVID, right? And so many issues just in the world, just in general, that it's really easy to relate to the kids. Like, hey, this one thing of bullying that you guys have between you is so simple and so ridiculous. Why are we even doing this, right? Why aren't we treating each other great? Because there's so many things going on in the world. Why are we adding to that, if that makes sense? So I would say that that's one of the biggest things, and it's almost one of those like it factors that you don't necessarily know what it is for your groups or for my groups in particular. I mean, I can try and describe it, but it's just something that comes somewhat naturally. I do allow my kids to have a lot of ownership and things along those lines. But one of the things I always constantly remind them, for me, and I think I actually learned this from Brett. He used to say that the only tradition that I carry on from year to year and that I care about is the tradition of excellence. Because there are a lot of things that a lot of programs might be doing that might not be the greatest, right? Might not be the greatest for how you treat somebody, or might not be the greatest for how you're focused on trying to get everybody going and playing together and things along those lines. So I like to tell my kids, like, hey, I'm glad that you guys have all your traditions, but I think that there's something that I think that you should always analyze every single one of your traditions every single year, because we evolve so much into life and evolve so much into what we're doing that maybe that one thing that started 10 years ago, 20 years ago doesn't need to happen anymore and things along those lines. So we do spend a lot of time talking about those types of things, and we spend a lot of time watching videos of people like Nick Saban or heck, I've been using a lot of Michael Jordan analogies lately because I grew up in Chicago, and The Last Dance, Michael Jordan's documentary, just came on a little bit ago. So we've used a lot of those analogies, and usually we try and take things outside this activity and try and relate them to this activity. And I find that that works the best in general.
Awesome. Well, this has been great, Derrick. It has been awesome to have you on here. We've kind of been ending a lot of these with, are there any other just final thoughts, advice, anything like that that you would pass along, especially to the students that are out there right now watching this?
Yeah, I would say that in today's world, I mean, we have so many things at our disposal that our elders didn't necessarily have. One of the biggest things being YouTube. One of the biggest things is, cell phones and videos and things along those lines, which can be bad in some cases because, we all know we can sit on Facebook and just scrolling down your news feed all day long. But you also have so much access to educational videos on how to better yourself, or maybe it's not necessarily even inside drumming or percussion at all. Maybe it's something just about how to be a better person, right? I'm listening to an audiobook of Phil Jackson, who's the coach of the Chicago Bulls and won 6 championships there and then another 5 with the Lakers. And just seeing like what his mentality was of greatness, right? And how can we apply the greatness that he had to our activity here? So there's so many different resources, so many different things you can do. For me, I always find that I never have enough time to do as many as I want to do. Because I have like a whole course load of something that I'm working on right now. And I just wish I could sit there all day, every day and just work on that and just listen to it and learn more. But that would be my biggest piece of advice, is just always be a continual learner, right? I'm always learning more things every single day. All of the greats in activity are still learning. I mean, technology changes every single day. There's so many things that you can grab from the person next to you or grab from a different instructor. Even if it's an instructor that you don't necessarily like very much, there's so much you can still learn from the instructor, maybe from the standpoint of what you don't want to be like in the future. But you can take all of those things, take all of those life experiences, take all of those lessons and put them together. And then you all of a sudden find yourself and what you mean in this activity.
Awesome. That is great. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this, Derrick. I think everybody's gotten a lot out of it. The way you broke things down and stuff like that has been awesome. For people that are watching, these are still going to be up on YouTube if anybody wants to go back and rewatch any previous episodes. I also want to throw in just talking about checking out what's going on and stuff like that. I'm going to throw in a plug for the group, the Fearless Flyers, right now, because they are putting out some awesome material, and Nate Smith's drumming is miraculous and feels really good to play a lot of the exercises that we've been going over in all of these sessions and stuff with also. So check it out if you can. So to wrap up, thanks again to Derrick for doing this and to everybody that's been checking it out. And we're back next week with, in a strange twist of scheduling, the only other person that I know that has marched both the Cavaliers and the Phantom Regiment, Wayne Bovenschen. So he's going to be doing next week's session for us. And beyond that, everybody just be good to each other and to everybody out there in the next week or so. All right. Thank you all for tuning in.